that she finds a good job. One of the hospitals will hire her, and she'll be able to move down here and be here with us, settle in with our family here. So, anything else? Anyone else? Eli's 2 today. I forgot about that.
Yay!
Yeah. We got him a little Schroeder piano for his birthday. So I asked him, I went home earlier this afternoon to switch cars with Catherine, and I said, show me your piano, and he ran right over and plopped down and just plink, 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 and just, I'm like, great. So we're actively raising a musician, which should be a surprise to no one that knows Catherine. So, all right. Anything else? Oh no, I'm not bothered by the noise. I'm not. No. Maybe on a bad day I might be bothered by the noise, but I'm a healthy. I partake of the chicanery of the amount of noise in our household. So anyway, anything else? All right. Well, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this evening. We thank you, Lord, that we can all gather together in freedom to study and to share and discuss your word, the history of your people. And Lord, we just want to lift up all the names we've mentioned here tonight, Lord, those that we've mentioned with our lips and those that we mention with our hearts, Lord, those who are sick and in need of healing, those who need a burst of strength, whether it be in their body or in their mind, Lord, whether they be recovering in the hospital or whether they're striving through school. Lord, give strength to those who are every day continuing to carry on with life as you've given it to them. And Lord, those who have lost strength and hope, we ask that, Lord, that hope would be restored to them, that they would not give up, that they would not despair, but they would reach out, Lord, to you and to those around them that can pour into them to bring them out of any dark places they may be, that they can rise to the occasion, Lord, to be the people you've called them to be the Joshuas, to be the Esthers of our generation. Lord, we give thanks for all of that is happening here in our congregation, all of the many blessings you've poured out, for the successes we've seen in our people, not just in their day-to-day lives and their businesses, but in their spiritual walk, Lord, and their growth. Lord, we thank you for our country. We ask, Lord, that it would be guided by righteous men and women, and that there would be good leadership elected in the coming months, that we would see an end to the conflicts around the world, in Ukraine and Russia, in Israel and Gaza, that we would see peace in mankind. We ask all this and we praise your name in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, so we do have quite a bit to get through. I actually was heavily debating whether or not I was going to turn this into a part 2 class, because we are both going to cover a lot here, but there's also so much we won't be able to cover, possibly at a later time as the schedule allows. Of course, and I say that, and I'm the one in charge of the teaching schedule. So, it's like if time allows, it's like holding all the power in my hand of what changes and what doesn't. So it's just, there's a good bit of information, but only because there's so much to be found. And the reason we're doing this is largely because the month of May is the month of Israel's modern independence. So we're trying to, we've attempted to dedicate all the Tuesday nights we're gathering this month to things that are associated with Israel's independence, both ancient and modern. For those of you who've been here on Shabbat the past few weeks, we've been mentioning that Isaac Halali will be here speaking a little bit. He'll be sharing a little bit on Shabbat, June 1st. He was born in Jerusalem before Israel was a nation state, so it was still British Mandate Palestine at the time. And he was born early enough where he was old enough to participate in the War for Independence in 48. He's fought in most of Israel's wars up until, I believe, the 80s. After the 80s, I don't think he's fought in any of those wars, but he's fought in 4 of them. So he's a true veteran of the IDF. and someone who has been both a first-hand witness and an actual participant in both the independence of Israel and the maintaining of that independence and safekeeping of Israel. So tonight we're going to begin with Abraham. Israel has its beginning with Abraham. That's where everything sort of starts with, particularly regarding Israel, with the covenants of promise regarding not just the land inheritance, but also the promise that the nations will be blessed by you. They will be blessed in you. Of course, ultimately prophesying the coming of Messiah. So there's several regional kings that go to war with the king of Sodom. So where Abraham and Lot are in their region of the world, several of the local kings decide to go to war. The thing to remember, these are not nation states going to war with each other. These are what we would call city-states. So this would be like Pensacola going to war with Milton, or Pace deciding to go to war with Navarre and Gulf Breeze. However that would work. So it's intertribal. It's not necessarily like large, like we see movies and we think of these large scale battles and everything. It's not necessarily like that. It's probably a few hundred guys scattered around in areas, fighting, duking it out, with one another. Battle formations weren't necessarily a thing, and the thing you're going to learn with a lot of these particular fights that we're going to study tonight is that a lot of them are more guerrilla in nature. A lot of them are more, I hate to say freestyle, but that's kind of, they're not, because in the ancient world, if you were a empire or a kingdom, if you were Pharaoh, the place of battle was predetermined, and you actually met and determined where the battle would be, and you sent messengers back and forth, and then your two armies would meet, and either they would fight, or it was popular to have a champion from each side fight. But either way, it wasn't warfare. Warfare has always been regarded as awful, and warfare has always been something you want to avoid if possible. Even the ancient people were like this. If you didn't have to fight, you didn't want to. Have the two best guys do it, and we avoid the big mess. But the big mess happened often enough. So anyway, the one of the kings, Chedorlaomer, kidnaps Lot and takes his possessions away. When Abraham heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he rallied his trained men, those born in his household, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Then he divided up his servants against them at night, and he defeated them. That comes from Genesis 14. Most sovereign entities, most nations or individuals in the ancient world did not retain a standing army. Believe it or not, standing armies are a relatively new thing for countries outside of the imperial spectrum. So even Rome, for the longest time, did not maintain a standing army until much later in the Republic, in which there were some military reforms, and in order to make everything more unified, they did create a standing army. But again, that's way, way later than where we are here with Abraham. And so instead, you have what is quickly organized, would be considered a non-professional, what we in the States would call a militia. And we have a lot of experience with that and history with that here in the States. Our country essentially, wins its independence on the back of militia. Of course, militia that get trained a little more professionally as they go. And militia, the way we understand it, is a little more of an English tradition, not so much an ancient one, but it's still the standard of having a disorganized force, yet trained and able to be called up, is the oldest standard internationally for armed forces. Again, large standing armies, equipped standing armies, well-trained standing armies are a relatively modern invention, a modern thing. I'm using the term modern. When I say modern, I mean anything 1600 on. So they're a relatively modern thing. However, it continues to be very effective, and because of where we are in today's world, I am going to use some modern examples of things. For example, Ukraine. Ukraine has essentially held at bay what was supposed to have been one of the largest mechanized armies in the world, with essentially what we would call local militia groups and National Guardsmen. When I was in the Army, we were phasing out of the... before I went in, everything was focused on Afghanistan. Everything was focused on dealing with insurgents, dealing with IEDs, dealing with, not a conventional fight. As I was coming in, we were phasing into the idea of coming up against armor, of coming up against actual weapons of war, not just bombs and mines. And so we studied, and we spent a lot of time studying Russian equipment, because Russia and China were supposed to be the next big things. And then, as I've been watching and listening to, people who talk about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, everyone has been surprised by what has happened. Largely, again, at the response of the Ukrainian people, the people of Ukraine, who have really stepped up and have themselves stood against Wagner and the backing of Russia, which was a shock to all of us. But again, these were people who had received some kind of training and had the ability to stand against a force much larger than themselves. So we have trained men. These men would have been trained with the weapons of the day, with movements and formations. You would have been trained with how to handle things like spears, swords, battle axes. During Abraham's time, there's not really a distinction between swords and battle axes just yet. They're actually kind of the same thing at this point in time. And of course, we can surmise that things like slings and bows would have been popular with certain individuals, but they would have had some kind of training with these weapons. When Abraham called up the men of his camp, this would not have been the first time they had put a sword in their hand. This would not have been the first time that they held a spear and went off to conduct warfare against someone. They would have held these weapons in their hands beforehand. I love the motto, or it's not the official motto, but it's one of the mottos of the U.S. Army Special Forces, which is, it is impossible to create Special Forces units after an emergency has already happened. So once we are at war, it is impossible to train teams, because those teams will be actively engaged in warfare. It's difficult to train new soldiers during an active time of war, especially when we can reach out and touch each other as instantaneously as we can today. World War II, we had oceans that put distance between us and Europe and Japan, and so we could quickly train up forces because we weren't immediately under threat. But today we all exist under a modicum of threat from somewhere, someone. I'm not saying that to be like you should be worried. I'm just saying that's how countries react. I mean, for example, Iran, launched missiles and things at Israel. And even though everything was fine in the end, it was within a 24-hour period, you had high projectile explosives making its way into the atmosphere over Israel. So these were trained men. These were men who, at some point in their youth would have been held a sword and been told at least go whack the post, a few times. Understand how it feels. Understand, the swing. How to not hyperextend your arm, when you're swinging this thing. So they were trained in some way. So those are just some picture examples of some of the different weapon types that ancients would have had. It's a little dark on my end, but I don't know if y'all can see that. I think it comes out pretty good on your end. Does it look all right? So this is called a khopesh. This is an Egyptian sword from the 18th century BC. So it's one of these intermediary, there's from a battle axe to a sword, beginning to have, instead of a staff with metal on it, beginning to make the whole thing out of one piece of metal. This was very likely something that they possibly would have used, because we often, when we think of Israel leaving Egypt, they left Egypt proper and went into Canaan. But even before this, Egypt was such a vast empire and had influence over Canaan, it had soldiers and people moving through there, trade moving through there. So even in Abraham's day, it wouldn't be unlikely to see weapons made in Egypt, found in Canaan and used by those in Canaan, who, even if they weren't being sold there to them in the land of Canaan, in Mesopotamia, it's very possible that they could have, in their trades and their traveling, having gone to Egypt and having purchased some weapons similar to this for their own use. So it's very likely that this was something that Abraham and his men would have had and used themselves. So Abraham and his men successfully rescued Lot and his possessions. This is kind of fun. I had fun finding this image. Likely employing what we would call a hasty ambush method of attack, and they attacked them at night. So it could have likely also been some kind of raid happening about the camp. The difference between the two is that Abraham and his men are most likely a lighter party of men, moving very quickly, and very likely adjacent to or just behind the party that is making its way, running off with Lot and his possessions. And so they're burdened. They're burdened with the slaves they have captured and the treasure which they have laden on themselves and their animals. So they possibly are not expecting this to arrive. But of course, Abraham does. And they quickly overtake their opponent. And of course, they attack them under cover of night. And so hasty ambush, for those of you who don't know, it's in the word. It's hasty. It's quick. It's something, you know where your enemy is. And so if they're on a route and you're moving either up towards them or adjacent to them, but you're able to move faster, it's where you can park your guys on the side. And as they're coming through, you hit them with stones, you hit them with arrows, you hit them with spears, and then you run in with your swords and you take them, take them out. I'm trying to keep this family friendly. Trying. But anyway, say again. Oh yeah. This is a very common formative movement. Oh yeah. No. I'm telling you, you just got to teach some kids with water balloons and water guns. Teach them, military movement drills, and like they will be. We're raising winners here, winners. And so, anyway, all right. So they're able to quickly overtake their opponent, and of course, they win back Lot. They win back Lot's possessions, and they're able to then go. And as they're coming by Salem in victory, Abraham gives tithe to Melchizedek, the priest. And this is important for us. This is a huge part of prophecy here. The book of Hebrews touches on this very event that happens, because this is the priesthood that Yeshua will inherit and will take. He makes and raises above that of the Aaronic, that of the Levitical, because Hebrews talks about Levi being in Abraham's loins, tithe to Melchizedek while being in Abraham's loins. So this sets up this very prophetic future of Messiah being priest, the great high priest. This is the priesthood that precedes all of the others and that will outlast all of the others. It sets up Abraham as a regional power. Abraham's not just some guy anymore. Now he's a sheik, but he's now a sheik that has defeated several kings within the region and has won back not only his nephew's stuff, but he's conquered their stuff that they had with them. So he is now in a better place and being renowned. And this is why by the time we get to where Israel leaves Egypt, Abraham is a known figure and his descendants are known figures. Jethro is a descendant of Abraham and the high priest of Midian. His descendants are not just nobodies. They're not just they're not like, they don't disappear into the ether of existence. They become these people who have influence and power and charge and responsibility in the world around them. The next major conflict we see in the Bible, of course, these are just artistic representations of some of the events that happened in the Bible, late 17th, 18th century. The next conflict we see in the Bible is in the book of Joshua, or the next big one, next big battle that we see. The book of Joshua, its campaign record, unlike many other campaign records of the ancient world, actually lends a lot of credibility to the biblical narrative. And of course, within the academic world, Scott, I'm sure there's a lot of argument about the validity and the accuracy of Joshua's account. But the way the campaign is written and recorded is it lends credibility to, this is not just some legend that was told by the Israelites or penned down, because it's not mythologized. It's not this legendary thing that happens. It's very practical what happens. It's a very rational telling of the events. And actually, I was reading, and those of you, whenever I do things like teachings and things, you can always ask me where I get stuff. I'm more than happy to share a lot of stuff I find, my books and things. So I use this one a lot for this class, Battles of the Bible, and it actually gives three distinct, you could break down Joshua's conquest of Canaan into three distinct phases. Phase 1 being the establishment of a bridgehead west of Jordan. So, having armed men and a nation crossing a river into a campaign. And for those of you who've done anything with the military, and even watch military movies, this is one of those things that you just know, crossing a river is difficult. It was difficult then, and it's difficult today. It is hard. It is hard when on the other side there are people waiting to kill you. You have to cross water to get to that point. So establishing a bridgehead west of the Jordan, a secure route for not only the rest of Israel to enter in by, but one that they can safely actually establish a landing point on the other side to begin their conquest. And remember, they begin this conquest kind of with the at the bottom of the hill, because what do they do when they cross the river? Well, they do that, but the whole nation, all the men are circumcised, because the nation has not been circumcised in 40 years. So the whole nation is circumcised, and we know Abraham was a little out of it for at least a few days when he did it as an adult. So, so imagine that. Imagine the faith you have to cross over into enemy territory, maintain a position, and then to undergo surgery, all of your fighting men at the same time, in anticipation of the campaign to come. Phase 2, to gain a foothold in the mountains. This map isn't the greatest, but Jericho lies sort of in this flat plain just before you get to the foothills of the mountains here. And here's where the mountains begin, over here. So it's this kind of ideal place to enter into the mountains. Now you can have Jericho actually protects everything on the other side of it, because likely it's one of the only routes that exist through the mountains into the rest of Canaan from this place. And so in order to enter into the rest of Canaan, they will have to take the fort. They'll have to take the city to continue. And forts have always been this way. You look at Fort Pickens, and what it protects. It protects the bay. All of these, they're positioned in such a way as to deter enemy activity, whether they be a marching force or a ship. Phase 3 is to spread out from the secured base on the central ridge to widen the area of occupation for permanent settlement. So, of course, afterwards, they go into Ai, and then they begin moving into the hill country, and later on to the south and to the west. Joshua commissions a reconnoiter effort. In army terms, that's just scouting. Reconnoiter is an army word too, but it's, Yeah, but most of our army words are French. Yeah, most of our army, and there's a good history behind why most of our army words are French. They had a good hand in our independence. So Joshua commissions a reconnoiter effort. He sends a couple spies, as all of you know. And this is important to do. As any good commander will tell you, you have to know the lay of the land. You have to understand what's in front of you. And what's off to the sides? Are there enemy forces that as soon as we go through the middle of this valley that are going to swoop in on us and, cut us off from our resupply, and we're going to get, hamstringed in the middle of the mountains? So scouting is important, and Joshua, being a great tactician, evidently, sends these to Jericho. So they come into a house or to an inn, and they meet the woman we all know, Rahab. And the Hebrew word for her is the word for harlot. However, there's debate on whether that means like prostitute, harlot, or if it's the word for someone who provides proper nourishment in regards to manner of store. So someone who, because the root word for zonah is harlot, zan is the word for someone who provides provisions. So because the debate, was she a harlot or just an innkeeper? Of course, you could say, like, well, maybe both. But we know that she provided things in some way. Food, nourishment, a place where travelers could stay, a place where travelers could reside within the city. And this is another great little strategic thing, because inns, taverns, saloons, coffee houses, all have historically been very great places for free information, free local information, free local complaints. Matter of fact, many of them are the beginnings of revolutions. The Marines, the legend is, where do they begin? In a tavern. Even the that on a bad note, the Nazi Party, gets its beginning in a beer hall, and its first strike at achieving power. So these are places where people come to drink and complain, whether it's caffeine or alcohol, So they're coming into this place, and they're likely listening to the conversation. They're likely trying to hear what's going on, how strong is the city, how many people are here, what do people anticipate the weather being like in the next few days, few weeks. And so, of course, they obtain the information. Particularly from Rahab. It's possible they heard it from other people, but they obtain information that suggests the psyche of the people is not strong, that the people there are intimidated by the approach of Israel, who they may not even know are there or present. Now, again, the king suspects there are spies and goes searching for them, but they may not know how much of Israel is, back at the banks of the Jordan, waiting to approach. And Rahab tells them, "The fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you have devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." And so the men negotiate an escape with Rahab, with her to survive, her and her people. It's not just her and her family, it's anyone who is within her doors, anyone who is within her household. And so, we do this today. Think of how, some of how many translators and informants and community representatives from Iraq and Afghanistan are now American citizens because of the aid they provided to our soldiers and Marines while in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now many of them live here. So this is not, you help the other side, they bring you on, and thankfully Israel was the right side to be on. And so they negotiate her escape and her household, and they retreat into the hill country where they remain for several days. Then they return. Of course, they come out of the hill country. So they actually flee, this way. They survive there for a while, and then they come back and they cross the Jordan, and they run back to Joshua. So these guys can go. These guys can move, and they can survive, evidently, for quite a while. And think about the fact that for those of us who serve in the military, or if you hike a lot, you're like, oh, boots, I can do that. These guys are wearing sandals. And they're swimming, and they're checking out mountains, and they're running in fields, and they're running in mud. Likely they knew how to scavenge for food. They knew what was edible, what was not in the countryside. How to rob, duck eggs. I don't know, whatever was available. How to find clean drinking water. Where to look for these things. So they were good survivalists. These were not, coming out of a generation before their parents were slaves and oppressed in a foreign country. I'm sure to some degree they all knew what it meant to, or had been told stories about what it meant to survive. Those stories and those legends and those helpful tidbits do pass on from generation to generation. You think about, I think about my grandparents and the stories they would tell and all the little helpful, hey, if you do this way or you save your money that way, it'll help. These were people whose parents, they survived with their parents the Great Depression. So, they are themselves survivalists, and they can teach, they had things to teach. And the best soldiers always are. Your best soldiers are outdoorsmen, and I'm talking combat soldiers. Like, obviously there are soldiers who have nothing to do with combat. Lots of sailors and airmen who don't. That's not their job. But if you're an infantry guy, you need to be comfortable outside. You need to be comfortable in the wilderness, and these guys clearly were. They went off, had a quick vacation in the mountains, and then had a cross-country jog across the plains of Jericho, a quick swim across the river, and back to Joshua to deliver information in a calm and orderly fashion. So Israel arrives at Jericho with a battle formation that is given directly from God. Can't fail if you approach with what God gives you to do. The priests are carrying the ark with the shofarot, the multiple shofars, leading the armed men of Israel in march around Jericho. They do this for 6 days. On day 7, they march around 7 times and then sound the shofar, or in some translations it says the trumpets. They sound the shofars, and the walls, as the song says, and the walls came tumbling down. Bum, bum. Western academia and a lot of scholastics, they try to look for ways to rationally explain, all of these events. There was an earthquake the day before, and so it weakened the walls, and there must have been something with the vibrations and all these other things. I mean, interesting stuff. It's interesting to theorize, but they leave no room for the supernatural. They leave no room for the miraculous. And this is largely a Western problem. This is not just an academic problem. The West is largely built upon that premise of academic and scholastic and skeptic. And so when anything supernatural happens, of course, it has to be easily explained. Within reality, it can't just happen because God said so, God forbid. And so the walls collapse. And so we should just take that for the miracle it is. We should look at that and go, God was there, God said to do a thing, they did it, and something happened in response. Take it at face value for the miracle that it is. For example, Joshua commanding the sun to stand still is a miracle. Something that, and of course there are many people who try to explain that, how or why not, or and it's interesting, and I'm not. Sometimes I have to think about, what can I get in trouble for saying or not saying. Not going to say it. So, yeah, I'm not going to go there. But anyway, it's a miracle that the sun stood still. We do not have to understand how it actually occurred or how to explain it within physics because, believe it or not, the author of physics can change, can do the things that he wishes with the world that he created, his own sandbox. So anyway, so there's no way to prove why God had them do it this way, march around the town this way. However, there's a good historical source that may shed some light on perhaps why they so easily conquered Jericho. And again, the important thing to remember is even amongst the miracles happening, God is still very pragmatic. God still has the Israelites do things that will result in victory. He talks. They have this. Moses and the tribal leaders of Reuben and half of Ephraim. They, about going in as the vanguard. You don't plan to have a vanguard. because a lot of people would just be like, why didn't God just go in himself and clear out the land and everything? Well, no, like he gave them a strategy to do so, and they actually planned to have a vanguard go into the land, to go in before the rest of the children of Israel, to be the ones who did a lot of the brunt of the fighting as they move forward. So strategy is not a bad thing, and it's not like anti-miracle or anti-God to think like, oh, you actually had to think about what you did, to do this. No, God gave you a brain. God gave you rational faculties to use, to employ, and to also appreciate the miraculous when it happens alongside. It's both. My students know I say this a lot. Two things can be true at once. You don't have to sacrifice one truth for another. Truth is just truth, what it is. So there's a statement from the Strategmata, which is a Latin, it's a Roman strategic book written for general officers, which records of an event in which Gnaeus Pompey on one occasion was prevented from crossing a river because the enemy's troops were stationed on the opposite bank. He adopted the device of repeatedly leading his troops out of camp and back in again. Then, when the enemy were at last tricked into relaxing their watch on the roads in front of the Roman advance, he made a sudden dash and effected a crossing. So he lulled them into this sense of false expectation. Like, oh yeah, it's just the company's daily walk, coming out of their camp, fully armed for battle, but they're going back in. Do that enough times. It's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. You do it enough times, and then the people watching, they're like, we really don't believe, what we think could be, and then that's when, in the wise words of the great sages, they get the jump on you. Oh. So Israel finishes its seventh day on March 7, it's March. It's final march on day 7, not March 7th. Jericho is completely unsuspecting, or so it seems, of anything. And you can almost imagine them thinking, oh, these people must be tired. I mean, especially after today, like normally they just march around once, but today, man, they marched around 6 times. Like, these guys must be tired, so just keep the coffee coming there, Hoshe. We gotta have some coffee here on this wall. It's tiring watching these guys march in circles. But they sound the alarm, they sound the shofar, and the walls, or a portion of the walls, suddenly crumble. But however they crumble, it allows Israel to suddenly attack. And in the confusion of the sound of both the crashing of timber and stone and of people, I'm sure, on top of the walls, Israel clambers up and takes the city. So that, again, just another. Now, again, artistic representation. The walls for Jericho likely were not that high. I've been on medieval ramparts. I've been on the ramparts for ancient portions of ancient city, replicas of ancient cities. They're not much higher than like the roof of this building. They're just meant to keep people out, and as long as it's out of, like, you can't jump it, then it's doing its job. Of course, a ladder could be used, but again, a ladder would be something you would have used in a siege. You were under, if someone was trying to cross your wall with a ladder, you're under attack. So these walls are just meant to keep the bad people out and to keep everyone safe within. And so they may not have been, 30 feet high, but they came down and Israel went in. That's what's important. So anyway, during this conflict, well, what country did Israel come out of? 484. 484. What country did Israel come out of? Egypt. And what did they do before they left Egypt? They plundered the Egyptians. So what kind of weapons likely did they have on their person?
Knife.
Well, Egyptian weapons. If I plunder the Smith & Wesson factory, what weapons am I likely coming out? The Smith & Wesson. So yeah, so these are, I grabbed some pictures offline just of some different, and again, you can kind of see how that same similar shapes and angles as the Khofesh, which again was only a few centuries before these. But these are, and of course, Hittite weapons are also local to this region and are popular. So it's possible that they're picking up some of those to use as well. And as you can see, swords are beginning to be kind of established as a real thing now. They're not like this combo of battle axe or scimitar thing. They're actually, swords are becoming longer, something that's made for not just stabbing. This is something up close and personal. You were stabbing someone with this. You're not doing anything else with it. Cutting bread, maybe. Swords. The swords are for stabbing, of course, but they're also for hitting and hacking. It gives you a little reach, something you can reach out with, so you don't have to get quite as close, because getting close is dangerous. You do not want to be close to the person you are trying to fight. You want to keep them away. Later on in Joshua, not till Joshua 17 or so, do we get to a period where they mention parts of Canaan having iron chariots. When they fight in these future conflicts, and again, they've had experience with chariots before, but God took care of that. When they conquer these people or in their regions, and this is one of those parts of the Bible that can be troubling sometimes for people to read. It talks about as they go through and they conquered these people with the chariots, that they were hamstringing the horses, which sounds cruel. But you have to remember that horses are not pets in this world. Horses are tanks. Horses are weapons of war in this world. They are not, they're not even used for like plowing. They're not used for riding. They're not kept in a stable and petted with a brush, pretty. They are put on in front of a chariot and used to run people down and to kill the enemy. And so what Israel's doing is, it's not this cruel thing. They are incapacitating the enemy's forces. It would be the same thing as if we came across, if we had a group of us who were, running through an enemy encampment, the main force is a ways off, and we come across some battle tanks and we have the ability to spike the guns on those battle tanks. We're spiking the guns. Like, you are maiming the enemy to be where they are not as effective as they could be. So again, it's important to look at those things through the eyes of the world in which they are existing. Yes, ma'am?
I've read somewhere where it could be either hamstringing or castrating.
Yeah, so they can't breed them either. Yeah, it could be either one. Yeah, so because some translations say hamstringing, some say something to the effect of castrating, but either way, it prevents you from either having horses or more horses. So it's taking away the enemy's ability to fight. It is in, let's see, is there another? Okay. It's in Joshua's taking of the land in which we see really the true future of Israel being born. Because it's promised to Abraham and it's given to Joshua. Joshua inherits it with the Israelites. And it says so. At the end of the campaigns in Joshua, when Joshua was old and just about to die, the author records that, "So Adonai gave to Israel the entire land that he had sworn to give their fathers. They took possession and settled in it. Then Adonai gave them rest on all sides, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one man of all their enemies withstood them, for Adonai gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one good thing that Adonai had promised to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass." So Israel here under Joshua inherits the promise, and this is where Israel really begins its story, leading up to eventually the Messiah. Yes, ma'am.
You just read about everything came through that Adonai promised. Where is that?
Oh, it's Joshua 21, 43 through 45. Yep. Any questions about Joshua? I know I'm flying through this, I feel like, but it's because we have so much. Next one, my favorite. David's mighty men. I don't know how many of you have read about David's mighty men at all. Very entertaining stories. It's definitely like the man's man, like, you know, grouping in the Bible. For lack of a better phrase, these are David's knights of the Seder table. You know, instead of the round table, you know, we have these are his right hand guys, his trustworthy warriors. These are the men that he calls on first and foremost to go on to fight. And of course, a lot of the narratives around David and these men also involve very human elements. For example, Uriah is one of these men. And what does he do to Uriah? Like, the things you don't do to a bro, that's what, you know, you take his wife and kill him, like, that's, no, you don't know. But all bro code violations have taken place here. So, but if you've ever read any material about, particularly around late World War I, early beginnings of the Second World War, about the Office of Strategic Services, the beginnings of black operations, special forces, a lot of these guys have very similar attitudes and drives. They're very go-getters, very audacious, bold. They seem to have very little regard for their own life, only that they accomplish the service in which they are found in, namely to that of David. And they have a lot of different exploits. You know, there's a couple of them that are mentioned for. Do you need to get in that? Okay. You know, slaying several hundred men. You know, one of them slays 300. Another one takes on two of Moab's greatest warriors and kills them both, defeats them both. You know, so these are the champions of Israel during David's reign. And when David's reign is discussed, you know, and there's a lot of there's debate about David's reign from on an archaeological standpoint, and a lot of secular scholars, a lot of atheists will bring this up, that there's not a whole lot of archaeology that tends to resemble David's time. But the part that they forget is the relational aspect of the reign. For example, in the U.S., do we have a lot of architecture left behind by the Italian, Jewish, or Chinese mafia? No. But they still ruled and reigned over parts, so much so that during the Second World War, the U.S. government actually commissioned parts of the Italian mafia to safeguard our ports and our harbors, you know, to keep any suspicious-looking individuals away from, you know, crates and shipping and ships as they were getting ready to go out. So, like, I mean, these groups had power. They had relational power with the people around them. And so, you know, David had this relational power. It's why his influence lasted well into the north, well into Egypt and into the east. You know, it wasn't so much that he left behind this legacy of construction. Solomon does that. David leaves behind a legacy of relationship, of being someone who was personable and who was able to lead. You know, getting a group of men to follow you can be one of the hardest things to do. But David managed to get these men to get along behind him and do things that most people would be like, no, I'm not doing that for you. and they did, and they were amazing. So this is, again, just another artistic rendition. There were at least 30 that are mentioned in the Bible. My favorite story has to do with what's called the Three, and it just calls them the Three. And that story comes from 2 Samuel 23, and it talks about, once the 3 of the 30 went down and came to David at the cave of Adullam during the harvest, while a troop of Philistines were camping in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, while the garrison of the Philistines was in Bethlehem. David said longingly, who would get me a drink of water to drink from the well, which is by the gate in Bethlehem? So the 3 mighty men broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem by the gate, took it, and brought it to David. And so, you know, this is I know people like this. This is why, you know, it's funny to me. they are outside of an enemy encampment. And David's out here just like, man, what I wouldn't do for a glass of that fresh spring water from Bethlehem. And he's got, the three who are like, fam, we've got you. And they break in through the lines. So whether they sneak or fight, we're not told, but they break into the lines of the Philistines, get water, and then leave with water and give it to David. And so there's more to that story about what he does with the water, but that's not important for tonight's stuff. But I kind of liken it to running the gauntlet like in an egg race. Like you're supposed to run down with your egg on your spoon, while everyone's taking a swing at you, and then, you've got to then crack that egg at the other end into the spoon, yolk and the white. It's big enough to hold it. Just imagine a ladle, it's big enough, but it can spill. And then you got to run back, with that, so there's it's an egg race. But I'm like, these guys are nuts. These guys are like, dude, glass of water, enemy encampment, you bet. And so they seem like people I would have want to have been around. These are the kind of guys who are going to come back and chief on a cigar by the campfire. Yeah, no, but think about how hyped you would be, like these guys, it's like what they did it, like let's all go do it, and that's how you win a battle. You got all 30 of these guys like let's we're not coming for the glass, we're coming for the well this time. So a lot of the weapons of, and this of course is the later part of the story where they return the water to him, and David pours it out and refuses to drink it because of the risk of life that they took upon themselves to get this water. So the weapons, of course, we know they would have been trained in things like spears, slings, and swords, because these were not just shepherds at this point. These were David's warriors. These were his personal guard. So they would have been trained in all of the weapons of war that a man could have fought with that did not require. So they probably weren't trained in siege warfare or anything like that, but they were trained to go get some water, and which is like, it's where hey, and that's the story you tell those of you that own businesses or work in offices. When the intern is like, man, why'd I have to go get this coffee? It's like, bro, look, this is important. Getting this water, this glass, it's important. Let me tell you why. So the bare hands, of course, because it doesn't tell us they fought with anything, but they went in pretty bold and audacious. Chutzpah. So these were the two main weapons. I feel like there needs to be like a mini-series about David's mighty men. I would watch the mess out of that show. But these were some of the men that, they upheld the Davidic throne. This is the throne that will bring the Son of David. This will bring the Messiah. This is the king that God makes a promise that your descendants will inherit the throne forever. And this is the same throne that Yeshua will sit on. And it's because of them. They have a hand to play in preserving the Davidic lineage, preserving this part of Israel and her history. They help in establishing David's kingdom in opposition to Saul. Later on, which involves, again, guerrilla fighting, running and fleeing, evading the enemy as Saul is searching for them. Fighting against Absalom's rebellion later in David's life when his son takes up arms against him. These are some of the people who remained loyal to him during that time. And of course, like we see here, always the Philistines, actively engaged with preserving Israel against the Philistines. And so these are just some of the things, and I probably should have titled this particular class the Warfare of Ancient Israel, not so much Wars of Ancient Israel. But these are some of the things that happen that preserve Israel for us, for our benefit as an ancient nation, through time. It's before its beginning with Abraham. Before we even have a nation, we have the priesthood, the eternal priesthood is, already, that promise begins with the tithe to Melchizedek, begins with Abraham. We see Joshua taking the land, and the fullness, the promises given to Israel, given and fulfilled. Of course, ultimately fulfilled in Messiah, but here, like, God keeps his word. And then, of course, in David, David's fighting men preserve him and his throne so that his throne is allowed to be established and remains forever, and is promised lasting eternity by God. So this is just some of the things. There was so much more we could have covered, and we may cover more in the future, but these are some of the big hitters I wanted to tackle tonight. Because, of course, we could have covered Maccabees, but I figured we covered those at Hanukkah, so we're probably safe in that camp. But not many people discuss ever David's mighty men and their exploits. Not many people ever think about how Abraham, fighting for his nephew, establishes him as a regional power, and of course brings him into connection with Melchizedek, which of course spurns on the greatest story in eternity.
This is a strong argument for what kind of man the Messiah really is, because the world tends to the baby and the meekness,
Right.
the white European,
Right.
Jesus,
Right.
person, but when you see like what his ancestors were like, he
Right.
has to be this strong.
Yes, Scripture calls Adonai is a man of war.
Yes.
It's not a, and it's not to say like it's not the same as like warmongerer, but you have to be able to take up arms and fight. Not just, of course, in the ancient world, but so much of the language that Yeshua uses and that Paul especially uses is that to live the life of Messiah is warfare. It is a battle, and you will constantly be engaged in the fight, and you have to be trained for the fight, and then when the fighting time comes, you have to be prepared to take up arms and go get that glass of water.
It strengthens the idea about the fear of the Lord. I think some people, they can't really fear him because they have this anemic version of him that
Right.
has been portrayed throughout history.
Right.
But when you realize that he is Adonai Sebaoth, he is the
Lord of hosts.
Yes,
Right.
is
Right.
the captain of the army, the angel armies.
Right.
That is a really strong and something to be.
Right. Yeah, and it's the same, it's there's a lot, again, for sake of time, there's a lot of stuff we won't be able to get into tonight, but in the future, I love the we talk about the angel of the Lord, this personhood of God we see in creation that appears, time and time again, that, and of course eventually becomes incarnate in Yeshua. He appears before Joshua, before they go into battle, as this warrior, and he's, not quite, he's like, whose side are you on? And he's like, my own, the Lord's side, so yeah, there is this, and again, and that's why it's one of the things that I don't, if there's a laundry list of things I dislike about a lot of Messianic Judaism, it's that we tend to focus on the rabbi, we never look at the soldier. We look at the teacher and the counselor, but it's like that passage in Isaiah. It's all of those things. He is the great counselor, but he also is mighty God. And that's like that, you don't get above that. And the government of the world is upon his shoulders. He runs everything, and he is more than willing to take away the things that should not be. And so you better be one of the things that should be. So, and thankfully we have, lots of encouragement and wisdom and information on how to be what we should be. So, anything else? Any questions, comments, concerns?
I think we see him in that way. When we see him that way, that's when we get our chutzpah.
That's when we get our chutzpah. That's right. Well, yeah, it's like, every commander that runs off into the fight. That's why I fully believe Abraham was at the front. leading in his fights, for Lot. It takes a leader to take the charge, and that's, again, when you want to talk about the history of warfare, that's why, leaders constantly good leaders are constantly at the front, leading their people on. So, anything else? No? All right. Well, the next class we'll get into next week will be about Zionism pre-Israel. So a lot of the talking and political developments that led to the ability for the state of Israel to be established, because a lot of people don't know just how many things were happening that allowed the state of Israel in 48 to come into being. There was a lot of moving pieces, a lot of people in powerful places, and it's good to know those, because as we've seen in recent months, there's a lot of people who aren't educated on all that, and to no fault of their own. There's sometimes people just don't know, and that's, and so we want to be people who know, because as G.I. Joe says, knowing is half the battle. So with that, I'm going to let you go.